the regular meeting of the Board of Trustees of the Alabama Community College System. If y'all please join me in prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we come before you in praise and thanksgiving today, Lord. And we just ask that you bless our deliberations and every item that will come before this body. Lord, we especially want to lift up our president, all the leaders of our government, national level all the way down to the municipal level, Lord. We just ask you to watch over them, protect them, Lord, and give them wisdom. Lord, I lift up the chancellor, his staff, all those involved here in the central office, Lord. I ask prayers for the presidents of all schools, for their staff, for their families. Lord, we know that there are challenging decisions that they have to make every day, and only you know about some of these. We just ask that you'll be with them all the way, and that they'll feel your presence in everything that they do. Lord, I ask your blessings on our students, faculty, and all those that are involved in the community college system. Lord, lastly, I ask you to bless this board and their families. Keep everyone that's here and present here today, Lord, safe in their travels today. Give us discernment, give us wisdom as we deliberate today and learn more about this system. Guide us and direct us. Thank you for loving us. Thank you for your grace and your mercy. We pray this in your name. We'll stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Here.
Here. Here.
Here. Here. Thank you. Item 4 on the agenda is the approval of this agenda. Each member of the board was sent a copy of this agenda prior to the meeting, and you've had a chance to review. I'll entertain a motion to approve this agenda as presented. Motion by Mr. Davis. For a second. Second by Ms. Foy. Once again, any amendments or additions or questions about the agenda? If not, all those in favor, please raise your hand. Those opposed, like sign. Next item, also, we each received a copy of the minutes from the last regular meeting, the June 10th meeting. Any questions about those minutes? If not, I'll entertain a motion to approve the minutes. Been a motion. Is there a second? There's a second. Any questions, any discussion about the minutes of the last regular meeting? If not, all those in favor, please raise your hand. Those opposed? Madam Secretary, any public comment today? There being no public comment, we'll go on to item 7, instructional and student services, facilities, fiscal, information technology, adult education, and workforce development action items. Chancellor Heinrich, I will refer this to you and let you lead this.
Thank you, Commissioner. I would recommend approval of 7A items 1 through 6. And if allow me just a moment to touch on a few of these items before review under item 1. This is a bond refunding that will save the institution a substantial number of dollars over the course of the next 10 years, just shy of $340,000. Item 2 is a request by by the board, there's an automatic $2 per credit hour increase that goes into effect each fall semester. And so with your approval, the cost of credit hour will go from $113 to $115 this fall. And item 6 is some IT network infrastructure that is really absolutely essential to Shelton State's IT function moving forward. So with that, I would recommend approval of these 6 items.
The trustees are well aware that we had 2 excellent conference calls that thoroughly reviewed all of these action items and the ones that would come later in the meeting. And I want to compliment the Chancellor for offering that, and for also his staff for setting that up and coordinating it. It seemed to work well. And thank you to the trustee members for participating in these conference calls and showing your interest and engagement in these items, because they're all critical. Are there any questions for the Chancellor about items 7A, 1 through 6?
I'd like to just thank the Chancellor and thank this committee for keeping the cost of tuition down. I mean, this is a very, very modest increase, especially compared to what we see going on in other parts of the country and even in our own state. And in the interest of keeping on the radar what's happening at the K-12 level, so many of our students are on free and reduced lunch and are in poverty. And of course we have Pell Grant. We have ways to help them become college graduates and access college, but it's still very difficult for our population to go to college because of the cost. And I know this is an extraordinarily hard figure to maintain the business case for our colleges, but it's very, very important for our K-12 graduates to be able to afford college, to keep it as low as we can while still managing the business cases of college.
Any questions for the Chancellor on these items? If not, the Chair will entertain a motion. There's been a motion. Is there a second? All those in favor of approving items 7A, 1 through 6, which are a bond refunding for Northeast Alabama Community College, Snead State Community College, new program in industrial maintenance technology, change in instructional role for Trentham State Technical School. Item 4, implementation of a meal plan for Wallace State Community College, Hansville. 5, tuition rate adjustment of $2 per hour. 6, Shelton State Community College purchase of network infrastructure. All those in favor, please raise your hand. Those opposed, like sign. Items pass. Section 8.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Also recommend approval of 8A, 1 through 4. And again, if I might just walk you through these items very quickly. Item 1, J.F. Drake has tweaked their mission statement, made a few minor changes, and that requires board approval. Wallace Hansville is requesting permission to enter into a lease agreement. Item 3, the 2015-16 salary schedules. Salary schedules have to be approved yearly by the Board of Trustees. These, I think as you're well aware of, we are into a compensation study now that we launched a number of months ago. So at a later date, a recommendation that will impact salaries. But these salary schedules are virtually identical to last year's salary schedule. In other words, there are no increases. In fact, we've had no increase in 8 years. But there certainly is no increase this year, but they still have to be approved. And then item 4, which is an item that we want to discuss a bit further, is a recommendation that came out of the responses we received from all of you for trustee meeting dates from this date to the end of this calendar year through December. Those are available in your packet. So with that, I would recommend approval of these 4 items.
Okay. Chancellor, I think when we get to that point, I'm going to entertain a motion have before you, motions in a second to approve items 8A, 1 through 3, and that is item 1 is revised mission statement for Drake State Community and Technical College. Item 2, a lease agreement with Wallace State Community College, Hansville. And 3, the Alabama Community College System salary schedule for 2015-2016. All those in favor of this motion, please raise your hand. Those opposed, like sign. That is approved. We now have before us item 8A4, which there should be in here just a tentative schedule of meetings, monthly meetings through the end of 2015. This was this list was put together based on I thought a very good poll that was taken from all the board members, and I appreciate the way it was compiled. And a lot of things were put into the thought of this. Any questions or comments from the trustees?
Mr. Chairman, is it y'all's intention then to tentatively plan for our joint meeting on November 12th? I noticed that's the same day the state board meets, almost at the same time.
We're going to let the chancellor and the superintendent coordinate that, so we'll hear more about it later. And that's what we'll see.
Okay. I think that would work nicely just for the purpose of this group. The
Right.
state board meets on November 12th at 10:30.
Right.
That, if that's what you have in mind, I think that would.
I think we're still in the planning stages on that.
One other item I might point out, if I mind, is this schedule is moving us to kind of a work session format, where we would have the board meeting, we would have lunch, and then we would have the work session immediately following lunch to discuss items for the next month. Just, I think you all were aware of that, but I just want to point that out again. That would allow us, I think, to have a more robust discussion about any items that might be coming up for the next month.
Chancellor, I think all the trustees, that's a welcome addition to our schedule, and it'll require a little more time, and I think will make us more productive while we're here on the meeting day, and I look forward to that. Now, to state, we will not, let's see, you set us up for a work session, but we don't have a work session set for today, so we'll have conference calls. Will you set up a conference call for the August 10th, 12th, 10 a.m. meeting? Yeah. Well, everyone can be looking forward to that, and I thought those were very productive, very informative. And if we approve this, we could change it as long as we give, good notice, legal notice for the change in the date and the time of the meeting. But this is
One other item I might point out, and I think I mentioned individually to you, that we will begin our off-site meetings very soon as well. And so we'll let you know about that. We haven't done exactly, but I really intend to start off-site with the September board meeting. But I will certainly let you know about that.
any questions or comments? Any further discussion of this proposed meeting schedule for the rest of 2015? If not, I'll entertain a motion to approve these dates, these tentative dates as presented.
So moved.
Got a motion, is there a second? Second. Any additional discussion, comments, questions? If not, all those in favor of approving this submitted schedule, please raise your hand. Those opposed? Next, we're on to item 9, Chancellor.
One of the items that I think I've mentioned individually to them as well is that we are
presentation, I would like to recognize some of the fiscal staff that are present this morning. If you're in the fiscal division, if you would stand up and introduce yourself. And we have two employees who are not present today. Robin Head is our purchasing and payroll person, employee, and Dion Thomas is also an adult ed accountant. What I'm going to provide today is just a very abbreviated version of our budgeting cycle. The budget request is due to the finance director on the 1st of November each year. And we start planning for this usually around the September time frame. So, and this is the budget request that we will actually, the legislature will debate and the governor will debate the following spring, and then it will start our fiscal year the following October. So when we budget and we present our budget request, we're actually budgeting for a year out, which is sometimes difficult. The first stage of the budget request is to determine the priorities for the system, for the system office and the institutions. And then we build our budget request around those priorities. The budget request, I think I cannot see the screen, so I'm going to have to kind of look back and forth. The budget request that we present actually will be the budgets for all the colleges, the system office, and all the divisions within the system office. And we have 11 appropriation line items, so you can imagine the detail that's required. The budget request has to be approved by the Board of Trustees, but normally that is after the fact. Timing is so critical. We normally submit the budget request in draft format, letting them know, the finance director's office know, that our board has to approve it, and it's pending board approval. The next step I probably could have just totally omitted, but I didn't want to. I wanted you to see the link. I think you're probably all aware that we submit our budget, and then of course the governor has his budget, and the House and the Senate each have their budgets. So we're here looking at 3 different budgets, hoping that they come somewhere close to what we've requested, and sometimes they do. Like I said, I'm sorry, I'm having to flip pages because I cannot see that. At some point in time, the parties will compromise, and they'll have a budget that the governor will actually sign into law. So then we have our budget that we can actually operate from for the next fiscal year. Once the governor signs it, then it actually becomes an act. All the bills that were presented become an act at that point in time. After we have a budget, the next step is an operations plan. We actually have to submit our budget to the Budget Fiscal Office Finance Director. And our budget is very detailed. We have to, for the system and all the divisions here, adult to ed, workforce, special pops, the different divisions here at the department, we have to provide detailed budgets. Those include salaries, benefits. I'm sorry, I did not flip the screen. Those are very detailed budgets that have to be presented. For the colleges, the allocations for the colleges are not, those are not cost reimbursement. They're actually quarterly allotments. I'm sorry, monthly allotments that are given to the colleges, but when I report them, they're in quarterly allotments. The colleges, we take the college O&M, which is normally the first line in the appropriation, and we allot those funds to the colleges based on the funding formula. That funding formula takes into account their historical allocation, the year prior allocation, and then some credit hour production, average 3-year credit hour production comes into play, so that we have some performance measures in there for the colleges. Marion Military Institute and ATN each have their own line item. So, and they also have to provide a budget to us. The system office, everyone here in the system office, the directors of each division are given budget forms, and they're allowed to complete their budgets based on their planned expenditures for the following year. All of these budgets are compiled into one operations plan that is submitted to the finance director. And I think I've completed that first bullet, but this is something that you also have to approve. But again, it's normally after the fact. We'll present it, and we send a letter to the finance director letting him know that we are submitting the budget, but it's pending approval of the board. And that's my presentation. Do y'all have any questions? Thank you.
Just one question.
Okay.
In regards to performance metrics or measures, what are some typical metrics that you use?
For the colleges, performance, the only measure that we're using currently, and we've used this for the last couple of years, is the credit hour production measure. We take the last 3 years' average of credit hour production, and that is based, their percentage, each college percentage then is applied to the remaining. Well, let me start over there. The formula is actually in three formats. First, we give them 90% of their prior year allocation. That comes off the top. And then the remaining amount is split 80-20. The 80% is credit hour production based on their percentage of credit hour production. And we apply those percentages to that 80%. And then the third measure is just a base. We take that 20%, divide it among the 25 institutions, because as I mentioned before, ATN and Marion have their own line item allocation. So that 20% is divided by 25, so each college gets their share of that 20%. So those are the three funds, the way they're funded, the three measures. But the performance measure is a credit hour production for now. Any other questions? Thank you.
Thank you, Jane.
Good morning. My name is Lynn Bell, and I'm from Wallace Community College in Dover. And I certainly want to say thank you for the opportunity to talk to you about our budgeting process. Jane has done a good job of describing to you what happens when my budget comes to her and how she assembles all the colleges together and does that part of it. There's a lot of work that goes on from our end before it ever gets to you or into Jane. We're going to try to master this thing. There we go. I Billy gave you a packet that has, first of all, a copy of the slide presentation. You don't have to reference that, but I prepared my slideshow with some spreadsheets embedded in it, and it's not cooperating. So there are two other documents that is in your packet, and one is the budget itself, and the second one is a spreadsheet. And at the right one, I'll reference those to you, and we'll move forward. We're going to move this morning from a big picture perspective to a more focused perspective. It's kind of good to know what your target is before you shoot at it. We have a person in our college that's responsible for planning, and she has a comment that if you don't plan, you don't know where you're going. If you don't know where you're going, you might not get there. So we have to know where we're going before we get there. Planning and budgeting are tied hand in hand. As a public institution, we're recipients of state, local, and federal dollars, and I'll master this thing yet. And we accept our responsibility of being good stewards of public funds. We do know and understand that how we handle the funds has a good deal to do with public trust, and we're committed to maintaining that public trust. First of all, the question is, why do we do this? Why do we go through the process? First of all, we have state and federal guidelines that require us to have a balanced budget. But just as importantly, we're all members of SACS, and that's the accrediting group that we're parts of that qualifies what we do as institutions. And the SACS has a set of core requirements that must be mastered and maintained by each of the colleges to maintain accreditation. The first one is core requirement 2.11, which says the institution must have a sound financial base and demonstrated financial stability to support the mission of the institution and the scope of its programs and services. First of all, core requirements are required and must be maintained, but in addition to that, it also says, SACS requires, that we have an annual audit, an annual financial statement, and an annual budget preceded by sound planning. The accounting and financial reporting format for the colleges is set by GASB, the Governmental Accounting Standards Board, and NACUBO. And they set up what the reports look like. About 5 years ago, there was a major shift for transparency that would have the financial reporting for the colleges look more like business and industry. And we have moved to that format now. There are 4 types of funds, and it's basic governmental accounting, fund accounting. We have the unrestricted fund, and the unrestricted fund is that area of expenditures that is for the operation and maintenance of the plant and for the operations of the college. And these are the funds that we have more discretion on how to use. The second set of funds is also the restricted funds. Restricted funds are basically identified from funds and grants and contracts that we have from outside sources. That may be federal grants or whatever. We basically use these funds to supplement what we do in the instructional process. There's not a lot of money in our funding to buy the equipment necessary for some of our programs like welding, industrial maintenance technology. It's very expensive. But we've been very aggressive at going outside with our college and trying to get outside funding, and we've been good at doing that. The third set of funds is basically the auxiliary funds. The auxiliary funds are those enterprise operations that we have at the college. We have a bookstore, vending service, and food service. We're one of the last colleges in the state still run our own bookstore, but we still make a profit at it. But those amounts of profits all add up, and they're combined, and they're usually transferred over into the unrestricted fund for additional revenues there. We also have the plant funds. And the plant funds, first one is the unexpended fund. There's subcategories of that. The unexpended fund is basically set aside for our savings account, for future projects that we may want to do. Right now, if you look through our budget, you'll see that we have a building that we have, that this board has already approved. And we've been saving for that for a number of years. So if we have money left over at the end of the year, we roll our money into the unexpended plant fund. In addition to that, we will also go outside and we will go for bond issues at some point in time. The retirement of debt is part of that as well as the cost of depreciation and those type of things that go along with the physical plant. This chart presents in relative terms the revenues of our college for all funds in comparison to the revenues of the aggregate composite for all colleges. And when you look at this, you will see that the majority of our revenues come from two sources. It comes from the state of Alabama, and it comes from our tuition and fee revenues. When compared to all the other colleges in the state, we all look very close to the same. Now this chart is for all funds. It's not just one fund, it's all funds combined. Same for the expenditures. This chart shows the areas that we would, where we spend our funds. We're very similar. If you will notice, the instruction is the major portion of our expenditure. We're a service industry, and as a service industry, we have most of our expenditures in personnel costs, which would be salaries and benefits. Here again, we also compare favorably to what the other colleges do as well. Some of the colleges have a lower cost for salaries than what we might experience in Dothan. In your larger areas where you have colleges and universities and persons pursuing higher degrees, you can get adjunct instructors, and you can hire adjunct instructors to teach a number of the classes at a lower cost than hiring full-time people. We don't have that pleasure where we're located, so we normally have to hire full-time people, but we do. We teach approximately 60% of all of our classes with full-time personnel and 40% with adjunct instructors. Also, you may notice on this chart that student aid is high. This is scholarships. We also have some sites that are prison sites, and so prisoners don't pay tuition, so there's scholarship as well. Of course, we get an allocation from the prison ed side of the house for that, but we show those as scholarships as well. If I could, let me focus you toward the spreadsheet. This spreadsheet is something that I came up with several years ago, and when you look at this, it has all of our instructional programs on the first page, and then we allocate our funds based on two factors. One is what it costs to run the program, and the other one is the number of credit hours that it produces. If you look down through this, I would point out to you that the next to the last line is welding, and welding has a cost factor, and these are have been established over years of time by myself and the instructional dean. Has a cost factor of 34.5 as compared to 0.8 at line 2 in the business department. What that tells you is that it costs less to teach an academic transfer type class that is basically a whiteboard and a lecturer than it does to teach a technical type program. Over to the side, you see a column by itself without a number on it, without a name on it, and there is a number there where I have taken the cost of tuition and fees for the English program, and I have extended that to show you how much money is gained by the English department for our college for 1 year, and it comes to about $1.7 million. In comparison, the amount of money that is earned through our welding program is $284,000. However, what is allocated to the welding program far exceeds anything that we would put in any one of the academic transfer type programs. And the moral of the story is, the lesson here is that we can't have a number of our technical programs without the support of our academic transfer programs. We are a total college, and all funds go to where they're needed most. The next page is gives you an idea of where the rest of our funding goes in our budgets, and this is the individual programs that we have where departments have to have funds to operate, have operations and maintenance, and all the different functions that go on there. These are historically based numbers. Once these numbers have been determined, then we start a process of disseminating the expenditures out to the individual departments and programs. And as I said before, all departments and all people in the college participate in this process. This is where we send an allocation sheet out to the welding program, and with this, that they come together and they determine how they want to spend their money. Now, we have welding programs at 2 different locations, and as such, one's on our Sparks campus in Eufaula and one is in Dover. We don't split this up between them. We ask them to come together and work together to work their programs out and decide who gets what. When we merged colleges several years ago, we found that this was a very good way of bringing people together and getting people to work together. And it's worked out very good for us. The next item is the budget for the individual departments. And this budget is online and it's fillable. And we allow the programs to come in and to put their expenditures in and submit these all back in where they're collected in the business office. The second page of this is where they sign off saying that everybody participated, and it closes the loop on the planning and budgeting process. As we move on, this chart is focusing on the unrestricted fund. And as you will notice here, our revenues come from 2 basic sources: tuition and fees and the state appropriation. Forecasting revenues is more of an art than it is a science. We in forecasting what we do for our tuition and fees, we take the actual tuition and fees from the preceding year, we extend that into the current year, and we reduce it to 95%. Now, our budget isn't complete right now, so we take 95% of the preceding year and we extend that, and that's part of the overall budget. But this year, in trying to balance the budget, 95% wouldn't do. We had to reduce it to 98.6%, but we do have a balanced budget. I would mention also that we have an inverse relationship for the most part with the economy. As the economy does better, our enrollment numbers go down. As the economy does worse, our enrollment numbers go up. And if people can get a job anywhere, then they don't see the need to go to college for the most part. This next slide, again, it shows you that we're a service industry, and 82% of what we spend is for salaries and benefits. You can't have a doctor's office without a doctor, so we can't have a college unless we have instructors. And that's where we spend most of our money is in people. And we try to attract as good people as we can. Again, this next slide is in the line item expenditure, and it shows the 82%. And the remaining portion, those different colors up at the top of the pie here, is what we used in the formal process. Today, you approved the salary schedule for next year. That salary schedule is what drives salaries and benefits. As Dr. Heinrich already pointed out to you, we haven't had a pay raise in 8 years now. It's starting to have an impact on the colleges, and let me explain to you. We have vacancies in the technical programs, and when it's hard to find people in the labor force, we need to have more welders, for example. Trying to find a welding instructor is very difficult because private industry can pay more for an instructor and more for a welder than we can pay.
Very difficult or impossible?
Well, we're finding some, but it's almost impossible. We've had to repeat searches several times to be able to find welding instructors. And of course, that's one of the industries that is the greatest need. But here again, it's one of those things that is creating a problem for us. It's a storm cloud on the rise, and it's only going to get worse. In closing, let me tell you what some of the principles are that we use to budget by. We live within our means. We don't produce an unbalanced budget. We can't anyway, but we don't manufacture revenues and we don't manufacture or reduce expenses to balance a budget. We deal with it as we go. We don't kick the can down the road. We make difficult decisions, and when we take care of things right now, if it's a problem now, it's going to be a problem next year, so we deal with it in the year that we're in. We may have reserves on hand, which you'll notice here we maintain adequate reserves for those things that come up that are unforeseen. You never know what's going to happen and what happens to you, so we've got to be prepared for that. At one point in time, we had a phenomenon in the state that was called proration, and that's where the state promises to give you funding and then it doesn't hold out. It's not there. And they have to reduce theirs because the taxes don't come in as expected. And we also make difficult decisions when they're necessary. Some of the things we've done at the college, we closed 11 athletic programs. We reduced down to baseball and softball only, and we support those fully. We closed non-involvable instructional program. The program is not producing. There's no need for these people to get a degree in auto body if they can't get a job. And so we closed those type of programs. We have closed auto body, small engine repair, upholstery, and flight program. We have the aviation college under our control. We've gone to a 4-day work week in the summers to cut energy costs on Fridays. And we contracted out custodial service and grounds maintenance. Those are things that we can hire somebody else to do cheaper than we can employ people to do these type things. And we've consolidated the administrative responsibility at the colleges to 4 deans. Our college has been merged, and demerged, and like I told Dr. Young yesterday, almost submerged. But we're down to 4 deans. At one time we had 13 deans in all this process, and through matriculation of persons retiring and taking other jobs at other places, we're down to 4, and we find that is efficient. I hope I haven't gone too long, but if you have any questions, I'll be glad to respond. Thank you.
Thank you, appreciate that.
Good morning. I'm Phil Dotz. I'm a partner of Public Financial Management. We're FAs, financial advisors to the system. We work a lot with all the colleges. I also have with me, I brought my lawyer just in case, Preston Bolt. If I get in trouble, I'll call him. But what we decided to do in this section is, I guess I'm supposed to hit this here. There we go. When Dr. Heinrich called me about this, I thought it might make sense to kind of put together a couple parts of this puzzle so they kind of flowed together more naturally than maybe several different silos. So Frank Barnes is going to talk some about the construction renovation project. A part of that process always involves getting identifying how the project's going to be financed, whether it's plant funds, debt, grants, or whatever. So that kind of ties nicely into the debt part of this thing. Jane Leatherwood's going to come back up and talk a little bit about what the fiscal review that goes on to make sure that there's capacity and the project is affordable for the college, whether it's a significant renovation or a major construction project. And then Preston and I are going to talk some about the debt process. Preston will jump in initially and we'll talk about structure and the format we have to work within, specifically the legislation that governs this body in connection with the issuance of debt and things you typically see in legal documents associated with the issuance of debt. Many of you hopefully have seen this document before. It's kind of a white paper he and I put together concerning financing of campus and other improvements. We have other copies of that today, which I think Jane Leatherwood's going to hand out at the conclusion of the discussion. Before I turn it over to Frank, I'd say that please feel free to ask questions as we go through this. Don't necessarily have to leave those to the end. We'd be glad to be. You're more than welcome to interrupt us and ask us questions as we go through it. So with that, I'll turn it over to Frank Barnes for some discussion about the construction, renovation, major project process.
Good morning. There we go, John. Thank you. This is a flow chart that shows y'all how a project gets to y'all for approval. On the left-hand side, these are projects that are usually under $1 million. Most of the time they're maintenance. They're pretty standard projects. So they go to a different path than the projects that are $1 million and above. Those would be on the right. So the way that works, anything that's going to be brought to y'all that's $250,000 or above, any project that comes to the chancellor that's $250,000 above will be brought to the board of trustees for your approval. Anything under $250,000 is, again, are usually maintenance, repairs, those sort of things. You do get a quarterly report on these, but they don't come to you for board action. These requests come from the college presidents. They're made to the system office, to the chancellor. If the project is $1 million or above, or if the chancellor wants to see even a smaller project, he can request that the president make a presentation to the executive project review committee. The presentation is done by the college president. Sometimes they'll bring their design professional with them. It's on some of these projects they have to have a rough idea of what the building, the size of the building, the use of the building, that sort of thing, before they can make the presentation, because they have to know about cost and those sort of things. So the president will come and make his presentation. He'll show the use of the space, preliminary programming that will usually be done with the design professional, the justification for need. This is very important. They have to show there's no other space on campus where renovation could take place and it can be used rather than building a new building, and also show where it's part of the master plan. Project concept, and that's, as I explained, requires the design professional's input. It's very important to locate these buildings on the campus in a way that it doesn't impede further progress and expansion of the campus. You don't want to take a big piece of land and just throw a building in the middle of it, because later on you might have 3 buildings that could have gone there, but they can't go there because you put the building in the wrong place. So that's where the design professional really plays a big role. Also, the exterior appearance and shape and size. We like to have continuity. We like for our campuses to look like a college campus. That, again, is something the design professional does for us. Okay, we do a financial analysis. King Leatherwood's department does this. We have to know if the school, what their F&E budget is. We have to know what the budget's going to be for the project, the life cycle impacts, fixtures, furnishings, and equipment, what that's going to cost. Life cycle impacts are things like utility expense, janitorial and servicing expense, maintenance and upkeep of the building itself. Replacement cycles are things like a roof, HVAC, flooring. Most people don't realize this, but if you take 100% of a building, 25% will be the construction costs. The other 75% will be owning the building. That's really important to look at that before we build a new building or renovate one. We have to know the enrollment projections and impacts of that, and type of financing, what type of financing is going to be used. And again, that's where physical would review that. And then any additional fees that are needed to help finance the project. On the construction project side, the school will advertise an RFP. They'll select an architect or engineer and their commissioning agent. All these RFPs are done by the Alabama Building Commission guidelines. The chancellor can endorse or deny after we have our review. He can tell the college, you know, these are more items we need. We'd like to look at this, or this project just doesn't qualify. So all this vetting goes on before y'all ever see it. We try to only bring things to the chancellor that he brings to you that we feel like will be a 100% good move for the system and for the colleges. So, once, the review committee has given its endorsement, the projects are recommended to the board, and if you approve them, then we use the design bid build process, and we get regular reports to facilities, which I monitor. I try to go to as many, OAC meetings, that's owner, architect, contractor meetings. A lot of times in these meetings, I hear things that I can help, avoid some big delays or problems. My background's in construction, so I understand the process, and it's very, very important for us to monitor the projects as they're being built. Our input has worked out really well. It's a good system. We just need more of me to go around. And any questions? Thank y'all very much.
Chancellor, I don't have any questions for you, Mr. Barnes, but just wanted to compliment you on your informative presentation, and I want to take this opportunity to throw an idea out to the board. As we're in our very early service and juncture as trustees of this system, I know many of you have voiced the thought that you wanted more information earlier, and just to be as well informed as you could be. And I just had the idea of, as we are confronted, or we view capital improvements on the different campuses, if it might not be helpful to our board if we were to form a capital improvement review committee for these projects to be submitted to before they appear on our agenda for approval. And we don't need to take any action on this right now. I don't need to as chair. We can do this next month, but I just want you to be thinking about it, and also get any thoughts that anybody might have about this idea. Anybody like to comment, or we can discuss it even later, but just want to throw that out.
Mr. Thompson, I have a comment about that. We're not getting in the weeds today, but in the future, I know the chancellor does want to get into the weeds on these construction projects. And I think it's important for the board to know about our existing inventory of buildings, which is somewhere between 850 and 1,000 buildings, depending on how they get reported. And it's important that you know that 60% of those were built before 1975. We've got a lot of old buildings. Some of them have good bones. They can be renovated. We have some fabulous projects. One at Gadsden that just got finished, an older building that's repurposed. It's one of the prettiest interiors I've ever seen. It's a new one-stop center, and it's just absolutely gorgeous. So we can make our old buildings look good and be competitive with our competition, which the 4 years spend a lot of money on construction, on new buildings. They realize nice facilities recruit students. And last week I was at the University of Alabama. I spent all day with their facilities department, and they confided in me that they'd had a mandate on construction to build as many new and modern buildings as they could, and things that had like rock climbing, anything that might appeal to the students to get more students. At this, right now, they're $1 billion, that's with a B, $1 billion in debt on new construction. But they can justify it because they're recruiting the students, and that's what they want to do. And I'm not suggesting we do that, but I would like at another time, and I know the chancellor would too, like to show y'all what's out there, what we have, where we're going as a system, and what we need to be concentrating on, because we have a lot of inventory, and it costs us a lot of money to own it.
That'd be great. That's an aspect we need to hear about.
Okay. Be glad to do that. Thank you.
Any other comments or discussions from board members? Go ahead, proceed.
Have a back one. I'm not there. At the same time that Frank receives his request from the president, fiscal does as we do as well. And we begin collecting the financial information that we'll need to do our fiscal review for this particular project. Bill's group will normally present us with the initial figures of maximum debt service, those type things that we'll have to use to determine if the college can afford the additional debt. One thing that we have to test, normally there's a predetermined percentage of the pledged revenues that we must meet, the college has to meet. Normally it's somewhere between 150 and 200% tuition and fees. It's normally between 150 to 200%. The tuition and fees, for the annual tuition and fees, the ratio to the debt service, I'm trying to say this backwards, I'm sorry. But the tuition and fees should equal at least 150 to 200% of the maximum debt service for the annual payment. That's one test that we must do. Another test is we must confirm that the funds are available in their current budget to actually pay the debt service. A third piece of that is we have to ensure that with the additional debt service, the college is still able to maintain their 2-month contingency as required by the chancellor. Once we've made these determinations and we're fairly certain, or we're certain the college is able to take on this additional debt, then we'll, in conjunction with Frank, we will prepare the action item. And at that time, we normally send it out to the FA, to Phil and his group, and to Preston, or whoever the bond attorney is at the time, and ask for their input to make sure that we've included everything that we should include in the action item. Also, I do want to mention, because I know there was some question about one day this week, we had some discussion about some numbers that were on a refunding, and the numbers were different on the action item that you were seeing from what the final numbers were actually projected to be. And the initial numbers that we received from Phil's group are just that. They're initial projected figures. And then closer to the issue date, then we receive the actual numbers that we change on your action item. So you can always expect to see those numbers change as we move along in the process. Are there any questions?
The job that we have is to not mess up the system. It is to provide you with the documentation and the structure that will make this happen. Under the act under which you were created, there's a provision for the issuance of bonds or notes to incur debt on behalf of individual colleges. You're the only way that the colleges can borrow money. They don't have that authority on their own. You have the authority only to pledge revenues from that particular college campus. In the new legislation, unlike the old state board legislation, we did provide for some flexibility so that you could finance multi-campus, multi-college facilities if that ever became appropriate, and you could combine those revenues from both. But the normal operation is that a single college has bonds outstanding secured by tuition and fee revenues from their particular campus. And that is done to avoid creating any debt, any general debt on behalf of the board, which does not have authority to incur general debt, or any debt of the state, of which you are an agency and the state is prohibited from incurring debt except in rare circumstances. So there is no pledge of state appropriations. In other words, the coverage test that Jane mentioned relates only to tuition and fee revenues that are pledged. It does not relate to all the revenues of the college. It doesn't relate to federal revenues either. And as I said, it is not a debt of the state. Our principal job as bond counsel, whether that's me or whether that's somebody else at the college has hired a different bond counsel, our principal job is to do two things. One is to provide the documentation that's required by law, both state law and federal tax law and securities law, to comply with all of those. And secondly, to issue an opinion that the debt is valid, it's valid, binding, enforceable against the board, payable from the source of revenues that's stated, and that if it's appropriate, and it almost always is, that the interest on those bonds is exempt from both the state of Alabama income taxation and federal tax, because that's really the reason that people want to buy this debt, is because the interest earnings are not taxable to them. That gives the benefit of the lower rates to the board and to the colleges. So In the documents that we have an authorizing resolution that we present for each issue. You approved an authorizing resolution for Northeast Alabama Community College for a refunding today. We will have a similar resolution in each issue that you would approve. And that resolution states the interest rates and the maturities, or some method of determining what those are. It goes through a number of covenants. It includes the pledge of the revenues that we talked about, whether that's just tuition or whether it's tuition and certain fees or tuition and all fees, which varies from college to college depending on what's necessary to secure the debt. And it also, in the case of refunding, as we did for Northeast, it would provide for a call for redemption of the old bonds. So we would get rid of the old debt, pay it off with the new. Lately, all the issues that have been done, and I think Phil will talk some about this, have been through a bank loan structure. That is, that an RFP's put out, banks bid on it, and you do that. That's a considerably simpler structure than we have where we go out usually for longer term debt. And in that case, we'd be presenting, instead of a nice thin resolution and thin packet of information to you, we'd be presenting a nice thick packet of information to you, all of which would be designed to meet the requirements for the public market, if those are sold publicly. And if you're familiar with offering documents for any kind of stock or bonds, you know what those kinds of, how detailed those documents can get. In addition, the covenants that are included in that resolution include, on behalf of the board, a covenant that if there were a shortfall, because tuition and fee revenues fell, if there were a shortfall and an inability to pay when due principal and interest on the bonds, that the chancellor is instructed to find other sources of revenues that are available and legally available to be used to pay that debt service. So he is charged on your behalf with finding other revenues. One of those sources of revenues could be the reserve fund that's created for a number of purposes. There's $1 per credit hour charge, as you know, for the system reserve fund. The system reserve fund holds those funds, and one of the sources that the chancellor could call on would be to pull those down, use it to pay the debt service, and then presumably pay it back over time as revenues became available. That has been instrumental in making bonds, particularly of the smaller schools, more marketable than they were prior to the instigation of that fee, which was about 10 years ago, a little over 10 years ago. And then finally, the resolution includes a number of covenants just related to the tax exemption for the bonds and making sure that they stay tax exempt. So what you see is a 12 to 15 page resolution will include a number of different provisions that cover all those areas. They look similar for each issue, but vary in certain important ways. And I'd be happy to answer any questions about that part of the issue, and then otherwise I'll turn it over to Phil to give you the rest of the information about how that all takes place.
Okay, starting on what is known as page 10 is where I'm going to pick up, and hopefully that's what's on the screen, which I really can't see. But I'm one short. Is that right? No, too far. All right, so there are basically two avenues that we would typically go down if debt's going to be issued on behalf of the college for a project or a renovation project. One is, as Preston said, publicly issued debt through an underwriter, sold via negotiated sale. The system and a number of colleges have done that over the years. I'll put that into context a little later in my remarks. The other is a direct placement that typically takes the form of what most of us would call a bank loan, but really they're still styled as bonds, so they would buy bonds on a private placement basis. We are, as independent FAs, we're not underwriters. We don't sell bonds. I'm certainly not a bank, and so we're ambivalent as to which direction the system goes or the college goes. We just want to lay out the options, consider the cost benefit of each, and then make a determination based on what we think the best approach would be. So, and the factors, and Preston alluded to a couple of these, would be the expected term. Longer the financing, more likely it is you're going to do a publicly sold transaction. Banks typically have an appetite for shorter term maturities. There's no bright line, unfortunately, that says 15 years or 12 years, but somewhere in that 10 to 15 year range is when you start losing a number We look at what the projected interest rates would be under each option. Of course, the transaction costs vary greatly from an underwritten deal to a privately placed deal. We work with the colleges. We work with, recently, of course, with Northeast, with Wallace Dothan, with Calhoun, a number over the last year and a half, and ultimately select the method we're going to go forward with and come back and then decide how we're going to go through the process to issue the debt and come back to the board for final approval. So the process for each is outlined on page 11. You'll notice there's not a lot of difference in those two. Primarily it relates to the offering documents that are used. In the case of a publicly sold transaction, that would be an official statement, a prospectus, if you will, that's put out to investors by the underwriters. And then the other, and we get ratings. There's a cost, of course, for that. Ultimately price it, and we get involved in working with our pricing group, as well as we work with the underwriters to make sure that the market levels or that the rates that they propose are consistent with what we believe market level should be for a typical A1 type transaction. In a private placement, we put together a pretty thorough, but nothing like an official statement, RFP, that is information about the college, the pledge revenues, historical data, etc. That typically goes out to anywhere from 25 to 30 different institutions that have an interest in this kind of debt. And we typically get, depending on their appetite on any given week, anywhere from 4 or 5 to as many as 8 or 9 responses. That's pretty much been the norm over the last year or two. And then we ultimately, it gets priced, it comes back to you for approval a couple of days after we get the bids back in. So what you see when it gets to the board is a final number. There's no change from the rate that's proposed, and in the case of Northeast, what the PV savings would be once things are priced. A couple of things I'd note, and I'm going to get pressed to make a few more comments on this, on both these topics. There are post-issuance compliance obligations that are referable to the board, things that you as a board have to make sure get done on an ongoing basis during the life of the financing. And they get confused a lot, but basically they take two forms. One is tax compliance. All this debt, for the most part, I think there's been some taxable debt, but very little, by the system over the years. But most all of the debt is tax exempt, and you have to follow the IRS regulations and guidelines and so forth established for the issuance of tax exempt debt, which is periodic monitoring of different arbitrage rebate issues and other things over a period of time during the life of the transaction. Pretty complicated area. It could also get involved. We also get involved in change of use. If you decide that that's going to go from being a student classroom to the whole building's going to be converted to a bookstore by a private vendor, then that's a change of use and things you'll have to deal with. Typically involved just you convert the rate to taxable, or you pay off the debt and it defeats it in some manner. The continuing disclosure is, and that applies to both public as well as privately placed debt. If it's tax exempt, you got to follow tax regulations. The other is continuing disclosure, which comes under SEC Rule 15C212, something that's gotten a lot of attention over the last few years, and actually got a lot of attention by the State Board of the Community College System last year during something called MCDC, the Municipal Continuing Disclosure Compliance Initiative, or something like that, which affected issuers as well as underwriters. And so there's a lot of retrofit work done here as well as other places. But those are ongoing obligations to make material disclosures, to submit annual financial statements to the market, to follow the processes that's established for that. So it's the one factor on a privately placed deal is it's not applicable. So if it's a privately placed bank deal, you don't have to worry about continuing disclosure. But if you've issued debt previously that's publicly rated, there's going to be pressure over time, and we believe it's a good policy to still supply that information as you would if it was sold publicly. And at the minimum, you're going to supply it to Moody's, which
Phil's covered the basics of that, of post-issuance compliance really well, except to say that he mentioned that this has gotten a lot of attention. I would just say that in general, as you might imagine, when the federal government's involved in something, the rules get slightly more complex every day, and the determination to enforce those rules becomes slightly more intense about every 5 years. So we are currently in a period where both the Internal Revenue Service, with regard to tax exemption, and the SEC with regard to continuing disclosure compliance are very active. It is almost incredible, there's some wood around here, I'll knock on it, almost incredible that none of the issues for the board, for the State Board of Education for post-secondary have been audited by the IRS because they have been very active in certain areas. I fully expect that there'll be an audit request at some time in the very near future. And when that happens, that's okay as long as everything's been done as it was anticipated at closing. Sometimes that was not the case, sometimes things change, but it's something that I know that Jane and her staff are focused on, and we have been trying to work with we've done some educational work with the fiscal officers of colleges for about the last 5 or 6 years, and are continuing to do that, and will continue to do that at the request of the Chancellor and of Jane and her staff to help them. But be aware that they are aware of the fact that your statements are that you will comply with those obligations. We try to make sure they have the information they need to do that, but it's a very complicated area, very difficult to stay in compliance with at all times, so they're working hard at it. Thanks.
Yeah, we excuse me, we both had clients in different roles, of course, that have experienced the joy of an IRS examination. Normally that goes pretty well. It's a fairly standard process. On occasion it doesn't, and that's what Preston's referring to. Sometimes it can just go on for what seems like an eternity. I'm going to put a little bit of this in the context, and I think I got the right one up there. You have currently outstanding about $300 million of debt, and that's broken down as shown on this spreadsheet or this PowerPoint. About $209 million that was issued publicly, it was rated, continues to be rated. Some of that number has come down some over the last several years as refundings have taken place, and most of those typically take place where there's less than, say, 8 or 10 or 12 years left to go. So a lot of those have been converted from publicly rated transactions to privately placed. You got about $97 million of non-rated privately placed debt. Recently, Moody's affirmed the system rating for the community college system at A1, and that's a solid rating for higher ed. I can supply other ratings, and we'll probably already done that to staff. But there are other. That's a solid rating. It speaks well to how things are done here. It is a system rating. It's not a rating of any specific college. The rating for any specific college would take place if they decide to issue debt specifically using those pledged revenues. And it could be, the rating could come in less than that. I don't think it ever has in the history of the system here. It's unlikely it would be higher than that, again, just because of the system rating kind of as a glass ceiling at A1. So that's where you probably wind up getting that. I think all the debt that's outstanding is currently rated A1. There are 62 revenue-backed transactions that Moody's ranks nationally. That seems like a small number, but a lot of that is because a lot of those ratings are system, and those are revenue-backed, and there's tuition fee-backed. A lot of those are system ratings, so it could be 20-plus colleges, much as you have here, or it could be for some other reason. In a lot of cases, community colleges are funded, locally with ad valorem taxes, and so they would be in a different category than revenue backed. You see how those ratings flow nationally. The highest rating is AA1, and lowest is BAA1. In the rating report, which I believe Jane has for you today, you'll note that there are strengths and weaknesses that are identified. I just summarized that part of the report. The report itself is 8 or 10 pages long, and you can see, I'm going to read all these things, but I mean, there's good oversight, there's strong budgeting process, there's good system-wide liquidity, and also the reserve fund and unrestricted funds that are clearly identified as strengths. The weaknesses are identified, primarily the ones that would drive the enrollment volatility. And lastly, this was a new wrinkle that they added this time, just that you were right in the middle of the process of going from the old system, let's call it, to the new system, and they were just, I think they're comfortable with it, but they just identified that as a potential weakness, depending on how things flow out. Anyway, that's our story. Any of us glad to answer any additional questions, and appreciate your attention. Okay, and Jane, you will have, Jane's got both those documents for your reading pleasure. Thanks.
So can you let us know, the board members know, what the status is of the common accounting software and where we are with that? I know that was put in the works for some time, and that's one of the identified weaknesses in our bond rating.
We have invested many hundreds of hours and we've received a variety of quotes that have done. We have a number of our colleges that have upgraded. We've got about 16 that have not. Right now, the quote for the system runs between $30 and $50 million. And so it really is a fiscal issue. In fact, just had a meeting just yesterday on a way that we might attack that a bit differently than we have in the past. But we're still in that $30 to $45 million range. So,
Speak to, tell the board a little back what we're talking about here, but I think they may not introduce it.
sure. Really what Mary Scott is talking about is a common administrative system, common computing system for the entire Illinois community college system. Each of our colleges had historically individual systems, and they actually still do to this day. A number of those systems are quite old and have some age on them, but most importantly is I lack kind of connections with those colleges that most system offices would have. So it's very difficult, not impossible, but it's difficult for us to have an overall picture of where all our colleges are, and the ability to communicate amongst our colleges and system offices is hampered pretty significantly. A number of in an effort to move in the direction that I believe we need to move, a number of our colleges have implemented or are in the process of implementing Banner. Banner is a common system that's used in many four-year institutions and many community colleges as well. The colleges that have moved in that direction have had the financial resources to do so. And it's been very costly. It's been in terms of people hours as well as actual cost. Said we have about 16 colleges that are still that happen. My vision is that we are all tied to the same system, and that we have commonalities across the system so that we can communicate with each other. But that comes, as I said, that comes as a cost. I still feel that is one of the highest priorities that the system has, and so literally we are working on this on a weekly basis to address it. And then there have been some other twists and turns as well, and Preston, you may be able to address this. Up until just recently, we have not been able to finance that kind of entity. Frankly, Preston, I don't know whether that has changed with recent legislation.
We included in the legislation, I mentioned that before the new legislation, you could only finance items for a single college. We did, and I mentioned that we broadened that so that you could do multiple colleges. We also specifically allowed the financing, it also related only to campus improvements. And we specifically included a provision for computer technology upgrades, including both hardware and, to the extent necessary, software improvements as among the listed things that can be financed with debt. So you do have that broad authority.
That's a very important change, a very important shift.
And it was done done with this in mind, but that specific change was done with this in mind.
We had a number of plans to address that, and they were all a little awkward, but this thing said, much more clean process. And so I fully intend to bring a recommendation to the board, in the not too distant future to address that, because we have this issue.
Did any of the trustees have any other questions for the presenters on these items? Most important, thank you all for the work you've done and the way you presented it so clearly and concisely. No other questions or discussions, okay? Item 10, Chancellor's report.
I'd like to use, call on Chuck Smith. Chuck has an issue that he would like to bring up, and ask him to do that during our report.
I'm gonna refer to Randy Bowman to start the conversation, and then I will, comment after that. Randy has worked on this issue and worked on this issue to, older and greater.
Thank you. We currently have I guess we would call it a difficulty with getting some telecommunication with Demopolis, between Demopolis and Shelton. Demopolis is kind of a new campus for Shelton, and really want to get some students there to connect, to be able to connect back to the main campus. And we've had some issues with AT&T specifically being able to run the lines that we need in a reasonable amount of time for a reasonable cost. Mr. Smith brought this to our attention. We investigated and basically have found that they have said for something like $18,000 they'll be happy to run the fiber, but it will take 163 business days before they could even get there. At the same time, even if they do that, they still want us to pay for a full years of service, even though once they get the line run, we'd only have 6 months of service within the contract. As you can imagine, these are not reasonable numbers and not a reasonable way to do business. We're kind of stuck though because of the ruralness of Demopolis. There are really no other telecommunication companies that we can even contract with or talk to about bringing these kinds of costs down and bringing them in line with what the school can afford and what's reasonable. It is AT&T, ma'am.
The original request for the supercomputer and AT&T was issued on February the 6th.